On the morning of March 17, 1983, a man named David Connell walked through the arrival gate at Dulles International Airport carrying nothing but a weathered briefcase and a photograph of his wife and son. He had spent the last 4 years in East Berlin, operating under a cover so deep that even his reflection in store windows sometimes felt like a stranger's face. The photograph was creased at the corners from being folded and unfolded 1,000 times in cold safehouses, in the back seats of surveillance vehicles, in moments when the loneliness became a physical weight pressing against his chest. His wife's name was Margaret. His son was called Thomas. He had their letters memorized, every word. Every loop of handwriting that promised him there was still something real waiting on the other side of the wall he had spent 4 years watching. He had not seen them since 1979. Since the morning a senior officer from the CIA's Directorate of Operations had told him that this assignment would require total isolation, that contact would be limited to authorized correspondence only, that the sacrifice would be worth it because men like him kept the free world free. David had believed it then. He believed it now, standing in the terminal with American voices around him and sunlight coming through windows that were not barred or covered in surveillance mesh. He was home. He had survived. And in 6 hours he would drive to the address in McLean, Virginia, where his family waited. He had called the number from a payphone. No one had answered. He told himself they were out, that Margaret had taken Thomas to the park, that by evening they would be together again, and the 4 years would compress into something manageable, a story he could tell his son when Thomas was older and could understand what his father had done for his country. David Connell did not know, as he walked through the airport with that photograph pressed against his palm, that Margaret Connell did not exist. He did not know that Thomas Connell had never been born. He did not know that the letters he had received, 53 of them over 4 years, had been written by a woman named Patricia Holloway, who worked in a windowless office in Langley, Virginia, and whose job title was Psychological Continuity Specialist. He did not know that the photograph he carried, the one he had kissed before missions and held during moments when fear turned his hands cold, had been taken from an internal personnel file and modified by technicians in the agency's Documents and Identity Division. He did not know that while he had been living in East Berlin, memorizing dead drops and photographing Soviet military communications equipment and lying to people whose trust he had earned through carefully constructed deceptions, his own government had been lying to him with the same precision, the same cold professionalism, the same absolute conviction that the lie was necessary. He did not know any of this because the program that had created his phantom family was classified above top secret, buried under operational designations that fewer than 20 people in the entire intelligence community were cleared to access. The program had a name. It was called Shepherdstone. And David Connell, as he left the airport and drove a rental car toward McLean with the radio playing songs he had not heard in 4 years, was about to discover what happened when a shepherd's crook turned out to be a knife. The house at 4127 Maple Ridge Drive looked exactly as he remembered it from the photographs Margaret had sent. White siding, black shutters, a maple tree in the front yard that would be brilliant red in autumn. There was a basketball hoop over the garage door, slightly rusted, and David felt something break open in his chest when he saw it because Thomas had written about that hoop, about learning to make free throws, about a neighbor kid named Jeremy who could sink shots from the driveway. David parked on the street. He sat in the car for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, trying to control the shaking that had started in his fingers. 4 years. 4 years of cold and fear and the constant low-grade terror that came from living 2 lives simultaneously, from being David Hartman, cultural attaché at the Canadian Embassy, while remembering that his real name was David Connell and that somewhere across an ocean his family was waiting. He got out of the car. The neighborhood was quiet. Afternoon light slanted through the trees. He could hear a lawnmower somewhere and the distant sound of children playing. He walked up the driveway, knocked on the door, waited. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Nothing. He tried the doorbell, heard it chime inside, waited. The silence had a quality he recognized from his operational work. The specific emptiness of a place that is not temporarily vacant, but fundamentally unoccupied. He walked around the side of the house, peered through windows. Furniture, but generic. A couch, a coffee table, no photographs on the walls, no toys, no basketball shoes by the door, no jackets hanging on hooks. He tried the back door, locked. He stood in the backyard, photographs still in his hand, and felt the first cold touch of something that was not quite understanding, not yet, but a predecessor to understanding. The way you feel a drop in temperature before you see the storm. David drove to a payphone, called the number again, let it ring 20 times, drove to the McLean Public Library, looked up property records. 4127 Maple Ridge Drive was owned by a holding company called Chesapeake Regional Properties. He called the company, got an answering service, left a message, drove back to the house. Sat in the car until dark. No lights came on inside. He checked into a Holiday Inn, did not sleep. In the morning he drove to Langley, showed his credentials at the gate. Was directed to wait. A man he had never seen before, late 50s, gray suit, eyes like ice water, came to meet him in a conference room that had no windows and walls that David knew were soundproofed. The man's name was Coleman. He did not offer a first name. He sat down across from David and folded his hands on the table and said, "We need to talk about your family." David felt his pulse in his temples. "Where are they?" Coleman opened a folder, removed several documents, slid them across the table. "These are the civil registration records for Margaret Elizabeth Connell, maiden name Hartley, born February 1948. There are no records, no birth certificate, no social security number, no driver's license, no passport, no employment history, no tax records. Margaret Connell does not exist and has never existed in any official capacity within the United States." David's hands were on the table. He could see them there, his own hands, but they felt disconnected from his body. "That's impossible." Coleman slid another document across. Thomas David Connell, born May 1975. Same result. No birth certificate on file in any state, no hospital records, no pediatric vaccination records, no school enrollment. The child does not exist. The room was silent. David could hear his own breathing. Coleman continued, voice flat and professional. "The photograph you've been carrying was taken from our personnel files. The woman is a secretary in our counterintelligence division. The child is her nephew. Neither of them knows their images were used. The letters you received were composed by a team of writers specifically trained in maintaining long-term correspondence with deep cover operatives. Everything you were told about your family was part of an operational security protocol designed to provide emotional stability. During extended isolation assignments, David Connell looked at the man across from him and felt something fundamental crack inside his understanding of reality. "I was married," he said. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. "I remember the wedding. I remember her family. I remember Thomas being born." Coleman's expression did not change. "You were married. July 1974. The woman's name was actually Karen Strauss. She was one of ours. The wedding was staged. The family members were actors. The hospital where you believe your son was born was a training facility. Every memory you have of that period was carefully constructed and reinforced through a series of what we call embedded experiences. You were told at the beginning of your Berlin assignment that your family would be relocated for security reasons, and that contact would be maintained through approved channels only. That's when the substitution occurred. From that point forward, every interaction you had with the concept of your family was controlled by our psychological operations team. There are moments when the human mind encounters information so fundamentally incompatible with its understanding of the world that it simply refuses to process it. David Connell experienced that moment sitting in a soundproofed room in CIA headquarters, looking at documents that proved his wife and child had never existed, while his memory insisted with absolute clarity on the weight of his son in his arms, the smell of his wife's hair, the sound of her laugh. "Why?" he said. It was the only word he could form. Coleman closed the folder. Long-term deep cover assignments have a 93% psychological failure rate after 18 months. Operatives become detached, develop antisocial behaviors, or suffer complete identity collapse. We've lost assets to defection, suicide, and operational compromise because they couldn't maintain emotional equilibrium in isolation. Shepherdstone was developed to solve that problem. By providing operatives with a stable family construct, we maintain their psychological coherence and their connection to the mission objective. You performed exceptionally well in Berlin, Agent Connell. You provided intelligence that directly influenced NATO strategic planning. You did that because you believed you were protecting your family, protecting the world your son would grow up in. The program worked exactly as designed. David stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. You created a fake family. You made me love people who don't exist. You sent me letters, photographs. You made me believe. He stopped, put his hands on the table, leaned forward. Where is Karen Strauss? Reassigned, married, out of the program. She signed a non-disclosure agreement. She will never acknowledge knowing you. And the woman who wrote the letters? You will never have contact with her. You will never have contact with anyone involved in the construct. As of this moment, Margaret and Thomas Connell cease to exist even as a fiction. You are to destroy any materials related to them. The psychological integration specialist you'll begin seeing next week will help you process the adjustment. David Connell looked at the man across from him and understood. With the same cold clarity he had learned in East Berlin, that there was no appeal, no higher authority to petition, no lever he could pull to change what had been done to him. He had spent 4 years of his life writing letters to ghosts. He had survived interrogations and surveillance and the constant fear of discovery because he believed there were 2 people waiting for him who needed him to come home. And now, standing in a room that absorbed sound so completely that his voice seemed to die the moment it left his mouth, he realized he had been more thoroughly deceived by his own government than he had ever deceived any target in the field. The psychological integration specialist's name was Dr. Ellen Marsh. She had an office in McLean with cream-colored walls and furniture that was expensive but deliberately unremarkable, chosen to fade into the background of conversations about trauma. David Connell sat across from her 3 times a week for the next 2 months and did not speak about anything that mattered. He answered her questions with the minimum viable truth. Yes, he understood intellectually that Margaret and Thomas were constructs. Yes, he recognized the operational necessity of maintaining psychological stability during deep cover assignments. Yes, he was experiencing difficulty adjusting to the reality of their non-existence. He used the words she wanted to hear. He watched her make notes on a yellow legal pad. He knew she was writing reports that would go into his file, evaluations that would determine whether he was stable enough to remain operational, or whether he would be quietly retired with a pension and a non-disclosure agreement that carried criminal penalties for violation. So he lied to her the way he had lied to Soviet intelligence officers in East Berlin, with the same careful calibration of truth and performance. Because lying was what he knew how to do, and telling the truth would mean admitting that something inside him had broken in a way that could not be fixed. What he did not tell Dr. Marsh was that he had kept one photograph, a small one, 2 inches by 3 inches, that he had torn from the edge of a larger print before he destroyed the others as ordered. It showed Thomas, or the child who had been called Thomas in the letters, sitting on a swing set with sunlight in his hair. David kept it in his wallet behind his driver's license. He did not look at it. He just needed to know it was there, this small piece of evidence that the love he had felt had been directed at something, even if that something was a fiction. He did not tell her that he drove to 4127 Maple Ridge Drive twice a week and sat in his car outside, watching the empty house, waiting for he did not know what. He did not tell her that he had begun his own investigation into Shepherdstone, using skills he had developed during 20 years in intelligence work. following trails through classified databases and personnel records that he still had access to because no one had yet decided he was enough of a security risk to revoke his clearances. What David Connell learned, working late at night in his apartment with files spread across his kitchen table, was that Shepherdstone had been operational since 1975. The program had been developed by a joint team from the CIA's Office of Technical Service and the Defense Intelligence Agency's Behavioral Science Program. The initial concept had come from a psychologist named Dr. Raymond Kessler, who had studied Soviet methods of controlling deep-cover illegals, the Russian intelligence officers who lived for decades under false identities in foreign countries. Kessler had theorized that the most effective form of control was not ideological indoctrination, but emotional architecture, creating relationships that tied an operative's sense of self to the continued success of their mission. The Soviets used real families, sending officers abroad with their actual wives and children, turning family units into operational cells. Shepherdstone proposed something more sophisticated and more cruel: manufacture the family entirely, control every interaction, eliminate the security risks associated with real relationships while maintaining the psychological benefits. The program had been tested on 12 operatives between 1975 and 1978. David found references to them in budget documents and personnel transfer records. Agents whose files showed unexplained gaps in their operational timelines, periods when they appeared to be on leave but were actually in deep cover assignments that required complete isolation. He found reports on psychological assessments, measurements of stress response, and mission performance, comparisons between Shepherdstone subjects and control groups who had operated without the fabricated family support structure. The data showed exactly what Coleman had told him. Operatives with phantom families performed better, lasted longer, maintained operational security more effectively. They also, David discovered in a medical review board document he found filed under the wrong classification code, had higher rates of severe depression, dissociative disorders, and suicide ideation after being debriefed about the program's true nature. 3 of the original 12 had killed themselves within 2 years of learning their families were constructs. 2 others had been institutionalized for psychiatric care that was ongoing. 1 had attempted to locate the woman who had written his letters and had been arrested before he could reach her, charged with making threats against a federal employee, sentenced to 18 months in a federal facility that specialized in holding intelligence personnel who could not be tried in open court. The remaining 6, including David, were listed as successfully integrated with varying levels of ongoing psychological support. Successfully integrated meant they had not died or been institutionalized or committed federal crimes. It did not mean they were whole. It did not mean they had recovered. It meant they were functional enough to remain classified assets rather than classified liabilities. David compiled his information carefully. He cross-referenced names and dates. He built a timeline. He wrote everything down in longhand on paper he bought with cash at a drugstore, never using computers that could be monitored, never creating digital trails that could be discovered. He worked with the paranoia that had kept him alive in East Berlin. Assuming every phone was monitored, every conversation recorded, every move tracked. He was probably right. He was investigating a program that officially did not exist. Using classified materials he was not cleared to access, building a case for something that he did not yet have the words to name, but that felt like the closest thing to truth he had touched since walking through the arrival gate at Dulles Airport. In August 1983, David Connell was reassigned to a training position at the farm, the CIA's facility near Williamsburg, where new intelligence officers learned the craft of espionage. It was a lateral move that looked like normal career progression, but felt like being put on a shelf where he could be watched. He taught tradecraft and surveillance detection and the practical psychology of running assets. He was good at it. Students respected him. He did not tell them that everything he taught them about maintaining cover and protecting your true identity was based on the understanding that the greatest threat to your sense of self would not come from enemy intelligence services, but from the people who sent you into the field in the first place. He lived alone in an apartment in Williamsburg. He did not date. He did not form close friendships. He went to work and came home and continued his investigation into Shepherdstone with the methodical patience of a man who had learned to wait years for intelligence to develop. He was looking for something specific now. He wanted to know who had made the decision. Not the psychologists who had designed the program or the case officers who had implemented it, but the person at the top who had signed the authorization that said, yes, we will lie to our own operatives about the most fundamental aspects of their lives. We will create phantom families and maintain the deception for years. We will accept the psychological casualties as the cost of operational effectiveness. He found the answer in November. It was buried in a budget authorization document from 1974, hidden in language about psychological support services and operational readiness programs. The signature belonged to a man named Gerald Pritchard, who in 1974 had been Deputy Director for Operations and who was now, in 1983, retired and living in Bethesda, Maryland. David found his address through public records. He did not call ahead. He drove to Bethesda on a Saturday morning and knocked on the door of a colonial-style house with a well-maintained lawn and a German sedan in the driveway. Gerald Pritchard was 70 years old, trim and composed, with white hair and the kind of eyes that assessed and calculated even while being friendly. He opened the door and looked at David for 3 seconds before saying, "You're one of the Shepherdstone cases, David Connell." Berlin, 1979 to 1983. Pritchard nodded slowly. "You're not supposed to be here. You're violating your security protocols. I need to understand why." Pritchard looked at him for another long moment, then stepped back and opened the door wider. "You'd better come in." The house was quiet and expensively furnished. There were photographs on the walls, real photographs of real family, children and grandchildren, a lifetime of authentic relationships. Pritchard led him to a study lined with books. He poured 2 glasses of scotch without asking if David wanted one, handed him one, and sat down in a leather chair that creaked slightly under his weight. "I've been expecting one of you to show up eventually," Pritchard said. "Not you specifically, but someone. It's been almost 10 years. The program's had enough time to produce casualties." He sipped his scotch. "You want to know why we did it? Yes. The simple answer is because it worked. We were losing assets. Good people, trained operatives, psychologically disintegrating under the pressure of long-term isolation. Some of them defected. Some of them compromised their own operations through increasingly erratic behavior. Some of them just walked away, disappeared, left us with burned networks and dead assets because they couldn't handle the loneliness anymore." Pritchard looked at his glass. "Dr. Kessler came to me with a proposal. He said the problem wasn't the stress of the work itself, but the absence of emotional anchoring. Humans need connection. They need to believe they're part of something beyond themselves. The Soviets understood this. They sent their illegals abroad with real families, which created its own problems because real families are security vulnerabilities. Real families can be compromised, threatened, turned. Real families have needs that conflict with operational requirements." He looked up at David. "Kessler proposed we create families that existed only as constructs, perfect families, stable, supportive, requiring nothing except letters and the operatives' belief in their existence, families that could never be threatened because they were never real." David set his glass down on the side table without drinking. "You created a lie that destroyed people's ability to trust their own memories. We created a tool that extended operational effectiveness by an average of 38 months per asset. Do you understand what that means in terms of intelligence value? 38 additional months of a trained operative maintaining cover in a hostile environment? Gathering information that saves lives and prevents wars? The program worked, Agent Connell. You worked. You provided intelligence from East Berlin that directly influenced decisions at the highest levels of NATO. You did that because you believed you had a wife and son waiting for you. You did that because we gave you a reason to survive. 3 of your test subjects killed themselves." Pritchard's expression did not change. The baseline suicide rate for deep cover operatives is 18% within 5 years of extraction. The Shepherdstone rate is 25%. Higher, yes, but consider what we gained in operational output. Consider the strategic value of the intelligence gathered. Consider the alternative, which is accepting that certain kinds of missions simply cannot be staffed because the psychological cost is too high. He leaned forward slightly. I'm not telling you this was an easy decision. I'm telling you it was a necessary one. We were fighting the Soviet Union. We were fighting people who would have murdered millions to achieve their objectives. We used the tools we had. Some of those tools were people. Some of those people broke. That's the nature of intelligence work. You know this. You've run assets. You've sent people into danger knowing some of them wouldn't come back. How's this different? David Connell looked at the man across from him, this architect of phantom families, and felt a cold, clear understanding settle over him. It's different because the people I ran knew the risks. They made informed choices. You took that choice away. You rewired our brains to love people who didn't exist, and then told us afterward that the love was the mission. You turned our emotions into operational tools without consent. Your emotions were always operational tools, Pritchard said quietly. Every intelligence officer's emotions are tools. The fear that keeps you careful. The empathy that lets you understand targets. The loyalty that stops you from defecting. We didn't invent that. We just refined it. And yes, there were casualties. There are always casualties. But the program achieved its objectives, and because it achieved its objectives, we won certain battles in a war that could have ended civilization. He finished his scotch. You came here looking for an apology, or an explanation that would make you feel better about what was done to you. I can't give you that. What I can tell you is that every person involved in Shepherdstone, from Dr. Kessler to the women who wrote your letters to me, believed we were serving a purpose larger than any individual psychological comfort. We believed the stakes were that high. And looking back, knowing what I know about how close we came to nuclear war in those years, I still believe we were right. David stood up. He had not touched his scotch. I came here because I needed to look at the person who made the decision. I needed to see if you understood what you did. I understand exactly what I did. I authorized a program that damaged 12 people in ways that some of them will never recover from. I also authorized a program that contributed to preventing a war that would have killed hundreds of millions. Pritchard stood as well. You're looking for moral clarity, Agent Connell. There isn't any. There's just cost and benefit, and someone has to make the calculation. That's what leadership is in this business. That's what you signed up for when you joined the agency. David walked to the door. Pritchard followed him. At the threshold, David turned back. I have a question. The woman in the photograph, the secretary, does she know her face was used? No. And the child, her nephew, does he know? No. David nodded slowly. So there are more lies. More people who exist at the center of something they don't know about. More damage waiting to happen. The program is ongoing, Pritchard said. There are currently 6 operatives in the field with Shepherdstone family constructs. The program continues because it works, and it will continue as long as we face threats that require that level of sacrifice. He looked at David with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been the clinical assessment of a problematic asset. You should stop investigating this. You should accept what happened and move forward. Continued focus on Shepherdstone will be interpreted as a security risk. You understand what that means. David Connell understood. It meant his access would be revoked. It meant his career would end. It meant he would be monitored for the rest of his life to ensure he never spoke about what had been done to him. It meant the choice between letting go of the truth or losing everything else he had left. He drove back to Williamsburg. He went to his apartment. He took the photograph of Thomas out of his wallet and looked at it for a long time. The child's face was laughing. There was sunlight in his hair. Whoever he really was, nephew of a secretary, he had been happy in that moment. David had loved that happiness for 4 years, had carried it through fear and cold and the constant possibility of death. The love had been real, even if its object was not. That seemed important somehow, though he could not articulate why. David Connell made his choice that night. He burned his handwritten notes in the kitchen sink, watching years of investigation turn to ash. He destroyed the files he had copied, the evidence he had compiled. He kept only the photograph. And then he did something that Shepherdstone had not anticipated. Something that existed outside the parameters of their psychological calculations. He wrote it all down. Not as evidence. Not as an accusation. As a story. He wrote about a man who had loved a phantom family, who had survived because of that love, who had been broken by the revelation of its falseness. He wrote it in the third person, changing names and details, making it sound like fiction. He wrote it the way he had been trained to write intelligence reports, with precision and clarity and emotional distance. And when he was finished, he sealed it in an envelope addressed to no one, dated it, and put it in a safe deposit box at a bank in Richmond. He did this because he understood, finally, what Gerald Pritchard had tried to tell him. There was no moral clarity. There was no justice waiting at the end of the investigation. There was only the choice between forgetting and remembering, between moving forward into a life built on lies or remaining trapped in the moment when the lies had been revealed. David Connell chose to remember. He chose to document, and he chose to keep living, not because he had forgiven what had been done to him, but because survival itself was a form of resistance against the system that had tried to reduce him to nothing more than an operational tool. He continued teaching at the farm. He continued seeing Dr. Marsh until she decided he was stable enough to stop. He was promoted eventually, given more responsibility, trusted again with classified information. He never spoke about Shepherdstone to anyone. He never contacted the other operatives who had been part of the program. He lived quietly and alone, and on the anniversary of the day he had learned the truth. He drove to Richmond and read what he had written, reminding himself that it had happened, that it had been real, that he had not imagined either the love or the betrayal. Years passed. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. New threats emerged, new enemies, new justifications for the things intelligence services did in the name of security. David Connell retired in 1998 with full honors and a pension. He moved to North Carolina. He lived in a small house near the coast. He did not write his memoirs. He did not give interviews. He existed at the margins of history. One more intelligence officer who had served his country and been damaged by that service in ways that could never be spoken about or fully healed. In 2006, Dr. Ellen Marsh died of cancer. In her will, she left instructions that certain files be donated to a research library that specialized in intelligence history. Among those files was a sealed envelope marked Shepherdstone Case Study 7, D.C. The library's archivist, following procedures for classified materials, contacted the CIA to determine whether the documents could be released. The answer was no. The documents were retrieved and presumably destroyed. But the archivist, a careful man who believed history should not be erased, had made copies before he called. Those copies were filed under a different designation, mislabeled as routine psychological assessments and forgotten in a storage facility in Maryland. They would not be discovered for another 12 years. If stories like this make you reflect on the hidden costs of secrecy and the weight carried by those who serve in shadows, consider subscribing. The Cold War created wounds that many never knew existed, and some of those wounds have still not fully healed. There are other stories from that era. Stories about people who were asked to sacrifice not just their safety, but their sense of what was real. And perhaps those stories deserve to be remembered too. Not as condemnation or celebration, but as recognition that the price of security is sometimes paid by people whose names will never be known and whose sacrifices will never be acknowledged. David Connell was one of them. He was not a hero. He was not a victim. He was a man who loved a family that never existed and who spent the rest of his life trying to understand what that love had meant. The answer, like so many answers from the Cold War, was classified. But the question remains, and maybe that's enough, Maybe asking the question, refusing to forget, is its own form of remembering. Maybe that's all any of us can do when confronted with truths that have been deliberately hidden, with lies that were told for reasons that seemed necessary at the time. We can remember. We can document. We can refuse to let the silence have the final word. David Connell did that. He wrote it down. He sealed it away. And decades later, in a storage facility no one thought to clear out, his story waited to be found. This is that story. This is what happened when a spy lost a family that never existed and discovered that the greatest deception had been practiced not by his enemies, but by the people he had trusted most. The Cold War was full of such deceptions. Some of them, like this one, destroyed the deceivers as thoroughly as the deceived. Neither side won. Both sides lost. And somewhere in the archives, in boxes marked with classifications that will not be lifted for another 50 years. There are other stories like this one, other names, other phantom families, other loves that were manufactured, and other hearts that were broken when the truth was finally revealed. Those stories are still classified. This one is not. Not anymore. Remember it.